Today's readings describe the call stories of the prophet Samuel and the apostles Philip and Nathaniel, all three of whom were called to participate in God's work of transformation during times of tremendous political, social, and religious unrest. Samuel lived when the Israelites were surrounded by empires that constantly threatened to annihilate them. People didn't know how to respond, and as we learned in today's reading, God no longer regularly appeared in visions or pillars of fire to tell them exactly what to do. In this confusion, God revealed God's self to a young boy who served in the temple. Years before, Samuel's mother, Hannah, prayed to God for a son, promising that this child would be raised to serve God. Neither Hannah nor Eli the high priest, much less young Samuel, could have imagined how Hannah's tremendous courage and faith would lead to the birth and call of the prophet who would guide Israel through this critical period in its history, when it was deciding how it should be and live in the world. Centuries later, Philip and Nathaniel lived in Judea under the brutal occupation of the Roman Empire. Systemic oppression and social, political, and religious unrest left people desperately searching for a Messiah, someone who would liberate God's people and bring about a new world and a new way of being. One day, a young rabbi who had just begun preaching finds Philip and says, "Follow me," even though he couldn't possibly have imagined what would come next. Philip chooses to follow Jesus. Then Philip finds his friend Nathaniel and tells him that he has found the Messiah, and Nathaniel needs to meet him. I think these friends often talked of the Messiah and the new world he would usher in. So of course, Philip couldn't wait to tell his friends that the man their people had searched for generations had finally arrived. Nathaniel, to put it mildly, is not impressed. Many other men had claimed to be the Messiah, and they had all failed. Why would ordinary men like Philip and Nathaniel be the ones to finally find him? But eventually, perhaps just to appease his friend, Nathaniel agrees to meet Jesus. Jesus greets Nathaniel as if he already knows him, saying he is a man without deceit. Jesus then explains he had already seen Nathaniel sitting under a fig tree even before Philip had visited him. Astonished, Nathaniel declares Jesus is the Messiah. I think this sudden reversal comes not just because Jesus knew Nathaniel's physical location, but also because Jesus clearly knew about and cared about Nathaniel as a person. Despite his initial reticence, Nathaniel's choice to humor his friend and then to follow Jesus changes the course of his entire life. He sees the heavens open as God reveals an entirely new way of being that brings down the forces of oppression and creates new systems of love and justice. And Nathaniel, both during Jesus' life and after his resurrection, serves as hands and feet of God to establish God's new kingdom on earth. Through a series of seemingly inconsequential choices, God called these three ordinary men to help bring about a new world in times of chaos and confusion. God called each of them to leave the lives they knew and the futures they planned for, to build the world God imagines for God's children. Their willingness to embark on these courageous and faithful journeys changed the world forever. Friends, I believe God has called each of us into the community of this small, ordinary church during this difficult and uncertain time for us as a community and as a nation. God called us to be in community with each other and to faithfully discern how we as a church can help build the kingdom of God on earth, just like Hannah, Samuel, Philip, Nathaniel, and so many others before us. And friends, living faithfully into that calling means making courageous, faith-led decisions about who we are and where we want to go. One of these decisions is how to be faithful stewards of our church buildings. Over the past several months, Session, with your insight and support, has been researching several different building options. In the next few weeks, we will share what we have learned with you so that we as a community can discern how God is calling us to live and work in the world. First, we will send out written descriptions of our findings in the packets you will receive this week before next Sunday's annual meeting. Then, during our next worship service, instead of a regular sermon, we will go into small breakout groups to reflect on these findings and begin to discern how we as a community should move forward. Friends, this discernment process is a heavy, difficult, and emotional undertaking, especially when so much in the world seems to be going wrong. We will get anxious, confused, even frustrated with each other, with church staff, with Session, and even with God. And that's okay. But I hope we will also remember the stories of Samuel, Hannah, Philip, and Nathaniel, and their faithful choices to follow God's call in uncertain times. I hope we will remember our own stories of how we were called into the Dickey Memorial Presbyterian Church community. Friends, God has called us individually and as a community into this sacred work of discernment, and God will walk with us every step of the way.